So first off, I'm going to say a bit about who is Bug Life. I think the vast majority of you probably already know who Bug Life is, but just in case you don't, we're the only organisation in Europe that are dedicated to the conservation of all invertebrates. So that's everything from things such as starfish to slugs, snails, bees, literally everything that has not got a vertebrate in its body. We try to aim to halt invertebrate extinctions in the UK and in Europe and achieve sustainable populations of invertebrates in the UK. So, for example, more recently, we pressured the EU body to stop the import of products using neonicotinoids into the EU, and we were successful. So they're now going to try and put that into place. So it means that people outside the EU are less likely to use them because they can't import them. We aim to accomplish this through protecting, improving, and expanding their habitats, as well as strengthening respect given to insects, because I think you'll all agree that the general population just think they're not really any use, or they know very few species in total. We do this by a variety of reasons, from practical conservation through to policy, raising awareness, and so on and so forth. Some of the spectacular species that people don't know about, sadly we don't get this one in Scotland, are things like the ladybird spider. They get this down south and it only lives on one site, which frequently gets burned by wildfires in the hotter summers. But I think you can all agree that as far as spiders go, it's absolutely beautiful. Amazingly, we have over 40,000 species of invertebrates in the UK, which is a bit mind-boggling. And as you're probably all already aware, that in Scotland, generally we have less species, but we still have 26,000 species of invertebrates in Scotland. Now, as you can imagine, people come to me all the time and they're like, what's this species? And I'll try my very best, but also there's only so much my brain can hold. 26,000 is a little much. But anyway, this accounts for more than 85% of all Scottish biodiversity. So that's everything from your mammals to your birds, to your plants, to your fungi, etc. 85% of them are invertebrates, or as the Americans have invaded over here, bugs. We have species such as the orange tip, which is all over the place these days in Scotland, that are very, very widespread, as well as rarer species such as the freshwater pearl mussel that people generally don't see that live in our rivers. Very specialised. We have internationally important populations, mostly because our rivers generally are still clean, or have been in the past. So a little bit about peatlands. I thought I'd give a bit of a wider context and then come in. So the orange on both of these maps is where all the peatlands are, both across the world and in Scotland. As you can see, this little black square here, we're kind of in a very important spot between, and we're also in this same latitude that a lot of peatlands are. Across Scotland, the vast majority of peatlands that are left, because we have lost an awful lot of them. In fact, we've lost 96% of our lowland raised bogs, and we hold 15% of the world's blanket bog, which is, as you all probably agree, very important. A lot of this area down here used to be lowland raised bog, and as you can see, there's hardly any orange left anymore. This is a more zoomed in map, a bit more complicated. The red area circled here is the Slamannan Plateau. The coloured blobs are different types of peatland. So for example, pink is what's classed as really good peatland. You can access this map yourself. It's a carbon and peatland map put together by RSPB and partners. And then all of the other colours are various regions of degraded peat. The black areas are areas where there's cities, etc., or if there's big loss, essentially areas where peat can't survive. So as you can see, there is a lot of peatland to the south, and there's larger blobs but more erratic to the north of peatland. And the Slamannan Plateau is a key part in connecting both of these areas, the south to the north. If we zoom in a bit, the whole of this plateau at one point would have been peatland. As you can see, it's probably less than half that today. and most of that is in a really degraded state. The Plateau was one of the first places in the world where shale was mined. So the whole area, particular historians, correct me if I'm wrong, is full of mine shafts and old train tracks from the mines, brickworks, a lot of heavy industry, a lot of bings, etc., etc. So as you can imagine, that through all of that disturbance, the bogs that are there are in a pretty sorry state. However, I'll go into that a bit later. Again, as you can see, it'd be fantastic if we made all of this high quality habitat, because it's perfect stepping stones from the north to the south. So what are peatlands? They don't actually teach you in school, even these days, what peatlands are, which is a bit of a shame. They might mention them, but they don't go into detail. Peatlands rely specifically on this wonderful stuff down here, this wonderfully colourful stuff called sphagnum moss. It's a very particular type of moss. I think there's about 36 species in the UK, and nothing else will grow peat, only sphagnum moss. So if you've not got the sphagnum moss, you've not got your peat. And an important misconception is people think that the moss creates the peat bog, and that if you get rid of the moss, you won't have wet land, but that's not true. Bogs are only there because they are wet areas to begin with. The sphagnum moss wouldn't survive in the first place. All they do is a good way to regulate it. The diagram on the right here is an example of a typical lowland raised bog. So what starts off as a depression in the ground, often over clay, stops the water draining away. And then the mosses start colonizing from the edges, fill in, and then over time they create this water droplet on a table kind of effect. Peat bogs, when they're active, they grow at only 1 millimetre a year. So some of my bogs are 9.5 meters deep. So that's 9,500 years worth of history, which is quite a lot. Blanket bogs form a little bit differently. They're generally on the top of the hills. They grow from the fact that there is so much water depositing on the top that it can't drain away fast enough before sphagnum moss can establish. And you can see a typical blanket bog here on the left-hand side. Like I already mentioned, Scotland holds 15% of the world's blanket bog, and it covers about 23% currently of Scotland. Again, it used to cover more, and the vast majority of this is in a degraded space. I think about 80% of Scotland's blanket bog is degraded. Bogs are very, very important for both specialist wildlife and as reserves for wildlife, particularly in droughts and heat areas. These are just some of the examples of some things that I get on my bogs. Adders, unfortunately, I've yet to find one in the Slamannan Plateau. There are no records from the Slamannan Plateau, so I don't know why they're not there. It could be that the degradation has made it that, and the disturbance has made it that it's not easy for them to be able to live up there. And these are some of the specialist species that you get on bogs. So as you can see, just from the different types of invertebrates, that it's quite a lot of species that are specialists on bogs. But you also have to remember that it's not just the specialists that rely on bogs. You also get everything surrounding the bogs, and other invertebrates that specialize on heathlands, etc., can also use bogs. Some of these of which you've probably never seen or thought or heard of before. So the top 10 centimetres of a peat bog is what we call an acrotelm. It's the area in which, the only area on a bog in which decomposition occurs, and it's also generally the area where all of your insects live that aren't flying. So example, for the larval stage or for the eggs. This is what we call a bog pseudoscorpion. They're arachnids. They're not actually scorpions, but they're more related to spiders. Again, they're also not spiders, but they look like very, very tiny. This is probably less than 1 millimetre long. Scorpions without the tails. The only way that you can find these guys is by using what we call a bug vac, which is essentially a glorified leaf blower in reverse. So you suck everything up. Bogs are extremely hard places to survey for invertebrates, just because everything lives in that top layer, and you won't see things generally running across the top very easily. We also see other specialist species, such as the window-winged sedge. Again, another species that relies on the bog being quite wet because their larvae rely on the wetness to survive and thrive. The bog sun jumper spider, which we do actually have in the Forth. We're one of only 6 colonies in the whole of the UK that have sun bog jumper spiders. These guys, this is just a spike of moss here, and you can see the sphagnum in the background. Again, very, very small, very beautiful. The legs are kind of green and glowing in the background. And the site that we have is Wester Moss near Fulham. And we're very, very lucky to go and see that. I still, myself, would love to go and see one of these spiders. And just look how cute that face is. I have to say, I have arachnophobia, but not for jumping spiders. They're very cute. Other things that we have are things like bog reed beetle, lovely, beautiful, iridescent colours. This is a type of water beetle. Fortunately, no English name for me to tell you. Helipius variegatus, probably because it's got variable exoskeleton. A large heath butterfly, which is really where I started my love of bogs, to be perfectly honest. When I was a student here at Stirling, through Forth Naturalist and Historian and Stuart and Lorna Bents, like Roy mentioned earlier, we did 40 years, and part of that was surveying where large heath butterfly had been and where large butterfly were now 40 years later. We surveyed 132 bogs across central Scotland, particularly in the Forth region, and we only found them on 20, which is very depressing. These guys live particularly in what's cotton grass, and if there's no cotton grass, these guys can't survive. So generally cotton grass and large heath are a very good example of having a very high quality bog. Yeah, it's fantastic. I think it's in journal 39, am I right, Roy? You can't remember. It's one of the earlier journals, 2012, 2013-ish, if you want to read about it. These are some of our lovely bog species that we get. Emperor moth, not so rare, but also beautiful to see. Argent and sable and Rannoch brindled beauty are both relatively rare moths that are very hard to see. Rannoch brindled beauty you get on Flanders. The females actually don't have any wings, so you just have to go around and look for some odd looking thing on a fence post in the middle of a bog. And this lovely little microvoth in the bottom left hand corner. Oh, there you go, there's the female of the Rannoch brindled beauty. Now, all of these species are lovely, but the only one you get on any of my bogs on the Slamannan Plateau is the emperor moth, because they're in such a state that they need a bit of intervention. So some of the threats, and I have to admit all of my bogs, or well, the vast majority of my bogs, these are past threats. So some of the threats that you get on peatlands are draining for commercial farmland. These are peat hags that form from that, extraction of peat for burning fires, and one of my sites, Grange Nuke, some of that peat extraction equipment, it was only for the local house, so it wasn't on a large scale, is still there. You can go and have a look at it if you like. They've still got their trolleys and things, and it's really interesting, actually. A lot of people don't think about this, but too much livestock on a peatland can result in too much grazing and too much disturbance. And if you think that the peat only grows at 1 millimetre a year, if cows are treading over that and hardening the surface, it makes the water run off, you lose the sphagnum, and then you end up with peat not growing. And then the only threat that still exists on my peatlands is afforestation. And the afforestation is a really big problem because, as you can imagine, bogs only grow at 1 millimetre a year, and once the carbon is in the ground, it's in the ground. It doesn't go anywhere unless we interfere with it, for example, by putting ditches in. But if the trees are planted on top of the bog and then they're harvested, it causes cracks in the bog, and these cracks then leak both carbon and water, as well as many other things, and lead to the lack of sphagnum again. Like I said, sphagnum, very important to bogs. At the minute, that lovely peatland restoration that Kevin mentioned earlier, Scottish Power Energy Networks and Scottish Southern Energy Networks used to do that all the time, what we call forest to bog restoration. They can no longer do that easily in Scotland because we now have something called the Control of Woodland Removal Policy. That means that it's extremely difficult to get permission to fell trees on bogs, even though bogs, in my opinion, are more important because they're more long lasting and they're more steady and stability. You don't know where your tree is going to end up. You don't know if it's going to end up burned, etc. Yes, the only accurate still threat to my bogs personally, more across the board in the wider context outside the Slamannan Plateau, the main threat is this. These are specifically peat moss related things, but your compost in your garden, unless you have something that states it's peat free, will have peat in it. And if you think about a metre squared of that, that's 100 years worth of growth. And that's not sustainable for us to continually do that. Fires are increasingly a big problem because if your bog is dry and then you get some vandal or you get a super hot dry summer like we have, it can cause problems. This ditch here is actually on Darnrig Moss, which is a triple SI in Slamannan Plateau. It's my largest site. This ditch is larger from side to side than if I laid down with my arms stretched out. It's some pretty massive ditching that they've put in the past. So in the past, Bug Life, this is before my time, I've already done some work on Fannyside Muir, which is a bog that's towards Cumbernauld side of Slamannan Plateau. And Scott worked on over 240 hectares of the site. He installed 4,300 dams and created 27 hectares of bog pools. He also did almost 60 hectares of scrub and non-native conifer clearance on these sites with a mixture of contractors and voluntary works. 660 metres of peat edge reprofiling, which is making a sheer edge, which the water comes out, turn back into just a gentle slope, so it keeps all the water back in the bog rather than it leaking out. He had over 320 volunteer hours on habitat restoration and creation, some of which was me. And the area of the site that's now favourable for the growth of sphagnum, so i.e. an active bog again and storing carbon and creating a good water quality, etc., is gone from 11% to 90%, which is an absolutely amazing result. Exactly what we want. Fannyside Muir in particular has had over 780 species recorded, which is pretty fantastic for a rural bog that's not got constant surveying on it. This is an example of one of the ditches that they had on Fannyside Muir before Scott put the restoration works in. Oh. And this is almost immediately after. Look at all of that water that would have ended up downstream flooding people's houses, etc. It's much better to put it into a bog because the bog breathes with the water, acts like a sponge. It just gets slightly bigger and then it shrinks again when it needs. This actually turned out to be a fantastic thing because I think this was put in 2014, 2015, almost immediately after there was a wildfire. So the other side of that ditch that you can see, there wasn't any restoration work done. This side of this ditch, there was restoration work done. The ditch being fixed stopped the fire. This is all a burnt area here, which is, I don't think anybody can argue with the worth of that. Peat bog fires are known to burn for days, weeks, and even years once they get going. So a fantastic result from our side of things. Yeah, the Fannyside Muir is also extremely important because outside of the invertebrates side of things, which is obviously my passion, it's well known as being one of the only places in the UK that you get tiger bean geese. And you do get people going up there and going on wild geese chases, which is great fun. You can see them pretty frequently when you're up there. And the moors and the bogs are where they spend their time when they're up there. Some more of the examples of the restoration at Fannyside. This was some volunteers doing a peat dam by hand, which essentially means that you take out the bad peat, the degraded peat that's not holding water back anymore. You dig a pit till you get to some good peat and then you put it back in. It acts like a giant rubber bung, stops the water coming out. This is a plastic piling dam living its best life. As much as I hate plastic, they're extremely good for keeping water back when putting in place. And you can see the sphagnums colonise the open water behind this pretty fast, and then the grass has followed it. These were cell buns, which are essentially underground walls that we've translated, and they're some of the pools that I mentioned earlier. The geese absolutely love these. They're fantastic roosting sites. And then this is an example of another ditch that's been blocked up here. So now we get on to my current project. This covers the whole of the Slamannan Plateau. Apologies if this is hard to read. Falkirk's up here, Bonnybridge there, Cumbernauld, Fannyside Muir, the bit that I just talked about. Now my site covers 9 degraded bogs across the thing, and that's over 6 different landowners, which you can imagine is quite a lot of arranging. Grange Neuk and Jaw Hills down here is complete. That's a fantastic little bog down there. Darnrig, as I'll mention in the next slide, is my biggest bog. That's the one with that giant ditch in it. That's going to be done this coming January. East of Drumclare and Salter Hill down here, these 2 bogs are also done. And once all of these are restored, it'll make a fantastic stepping stone for habitats, and we hope that we get more bog specialist species back into these bogs in the central belt of Scotland. So far, of those 3 lowland raised bogs that I mentioned, we've worked on 32 hectares worth of sites that's restored. 84 hectares is the size of Darnrig that's planned for this winter coming January, and 114 more hectares planned for the future, so that's next year. So far we've put in 1,300 dams, 6 kilometres of bunds and reprofiling, which is an awful lot, as you can imagine. We've cleared 8 hectares of scrub and non-native conifers, mostly through trees that have been felled in the past, and then everything's re-establishing. And we've had 780 volunteer hours on habitat creation, restoration and monitoring. So I also monitor these sites and go out and check the water levels to see where's worst parts of the sites and what's working, what's not. So far, we've had over 460 species recorded on these sites. That's my current site. So that covers this area here. This is Darnrig here, and a little bit of down here. I am also working on a future project, again in the Slamannan Plateau, to try and make the ecological coherence of the whole plateau work as a whole. And that's going to be for another 103 or so hectares, again dealing with tiger bean geese roosting, as well as trying to up the habitat quality for invertebrates on a whole variety of sites. So how can you help with the plight of peatlands? Well, the main one that I have to plead is please, 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 please buy peat-free compost. I know a lot of people struggle with tomato growing for peat-free compost, but there's some fantastic guides online on how best to use your peat-free compost and have successful tomato growing. We also run practical conservation days, like you can see here, chopping down trees. We run surveys, so coming out and having a look and seeing what invertebrates, deer, etc. on the bogs, as well as monitoring in all weathers, as you could probably see from the other slide. Oh no, yes, here we go. This is me and my best volunteer out in all weathers. I don't make everybody come out, he's just keen. And we go out once a month and we take water levels across the site. There's 90 points to take in total. And it comes back and I crunch the numbers and see which parts of the site are the driest and which parts are the wettest. You see some fantastic wildlife whilst you're out there. Water rail, you see kestrels, you see red kites, all sorts of things. These are some of the examples of some of the peat-free compost that you could get, but there are a lot more, and I suspect probably even more coming. I've been working with DEFRA and a whole host of NGOs in England, and they're now going to ban the sale and extraction of peat in England by 2024. It's set for in a horticultural capacity. I also mentioned plants on that last page. What most people don't understand is that imported plants or plants in quite a lot of nurseries aren't peat free. They're grown in peat, particularly if they're rhododendrons or azaleas. Just because they need more acidity, and the horticultural industry haven't decided a way that's best to do that. It is possible, but they've not done it on a commercial scale. So I think hopefully I've not rattled through that too fast. I'm going to stop with, this is my next practical conservation day.